Hello, welcome. We're just going to be starting in just a few minutes. So, my name is Sheena Cruikshank. For those of you who don't know me, I have the honour of being the academic lead for public engagement here at the university, and I have the even bigger honour of introducing Jess today. So I am delighted to open this, our International Women's Day celebration, from the Faculty of Biology, Medicine and Health. The University of Manchester and FBMH play a key role in promoting gender equality in Manchester. This is partly arising from our history. Manchester is the birthplace of the suffragette movement, and this was founded, of course, by Emmeline Pankhurst, which was just off Oxford Road, so not so far from here. And the topic of gender equality is just as relevant today in light of the many recent events that are highlighted in the media, unfortunately. So we should all be thinking about what we can do to accelerate gender equality. And in keeping with this today, we are asking for donations of sanitary products for Emmeline's Pantry, a local food bank run by women for vulnerable women and their families in Manchester. Thousands of women in the UK can't afford to buy sanitary products, and every donation helps. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here today to celebrate International Women's Day today with this talk, and we have an exciting upcoming programme of events, including specialist workshops in the next few weeks. But now to introduce you to Jess Wade. She is a physicist, she's an early career researcher at the Imperial College in London, and we're so delighted to have her as our keynote speaker today at this annual celebration. Not just because of her research into polymer-based light-emitting diodes, but Jess is also acclaimed for her tireless work campaigning inequality. As a woman of science, she knows firsthand how isolating it can be to be in a minority, and she is determined to change this. At our last year International Women's Day event, we welcomed Angela Saini to talk about her book, Inferior, which addressed sexism in science, debunked myths about women and gender stereotypes through impartial, critical and powerful research. Jess campaigned for this book to be in every school in the UK, a campaign that was so successful that it reached 117% of its crowdfunding target of £20,000. Her passion for supporting women in science led her to tackle the gender bias on Wikipedia. Around 90% of Wiki editors are male. By adding more pages of women in science to Wikipedia every day, and Jess really, she does this every single day, and I can attest to this. She has even made a page for me, which was such an honour and a privilege. She is expanding women's representation on one of the most read websites in the world. Jess is making science a better place for everyone working in it through encouraging girls and empowering women. So I am so excited to hand you over to our guest speaker today, Dr. Jess Wade.
Thank you so much. I'm very worried about this.
It's going to be fine, and if it's not, we'll work around it.
I want some pictures.
Oh, what happened there? Did I do that?
No, I don't think you did.
Here we go.
Okay, let's try it. We'll go for as long as we can. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me, everyone. It's okay. We're going to just roll with it until it breaks again. So this is a massive honour for me, not just because I really...
It's on that one.
Should we go with just the sides? Okay, so not only because of the kind introduction, but because my family has a really long history in Manchester, actually. So my grandfather studied at Manchester Grammar School. There's a small picture of him here at primary school on the left-hand side. All four of my grandparents studied medicine here at Manchester. My mum studied medicine here at Manchester. There she is, looking very beautiful. And I told her I'd put this great picture in of when she met my dad here in Manchester, also with her brother who studied psychology in Manchester. So Manchester is a massive part of my life, so this is a huge deal for that. And also because gender equality is really important to me, as you heard earlier on. So I thought I'd tell you a bit about my science first, because that's really important. I want you to believe I am still a real scientist, just doing this in my spare time. So I work in the Center for Plastic Electronics at Imperial, where we're combining materials that have the electronic properties of things like silicon with the flexible mechanical properties of things like carbon. So we use carbon-based semiconductors. And these really have really neat, fantastic things we can do with them. So we can dissolve them in solvents and make semiconducting organic inks. And my job particularly, as mentioned in the introduction, is trying to turn these into organic light-emitting diodes. And this has been super successful, not by me, but it's currently the screen if you've got an iPhone X. Those feature OLED pixels. What my part is particularly, and I think this is a bit heavy on the physics for this lecture, but I think it's still really cool. So we're trying to make circularly polarized light-emitting diodes. So these are light-emitting diodes that emit circularly polarized light. And this is very familiar with, if anyone knows about linearly polarized light or has some fancy sunglasses that only let through one polarization of light. In circularly polarized light, you have an electric field of your light wave which is rotating as it moves towards you, so it's twisting in either a left-handed or a right-handed way. And this is really clever, and it's a big thing in the display industry. I feel like this one is just going to keep flashing, so we need better OLEDs there, by the way. So, and this is because if you've got a television screen at home, if you have a fancy OLED display, then you've got an electrode at the back that's very shiny. And what happens when light comes in, if you don't have any filter there, is that light will come in through the screen, through the front, hit that. What we try and do is minimize the glare, and we do that by putting a circularly polarizing filter there. So if light comes in, it goes through that filter, becomes right-handed, hits off that shiny electrode, becomes left-handed and can't get out. And that's great, and that means you don't get any glare when you're watching television, but it does mean that if your pixel's emitting unpolarized light, only 50% of that can get through that filter. So what we're trying to do is create television screens that emit circularly polarized light so you get no loss. So it's a really neat area of science that kind of intersects physics, chemistry, and materials, but has really big applications in industry. And I guess these materials are really fantastic, not only for making these different electronic devices like LEDs and solar panels, but also because they're really biocompatible. And actually, my favorite research in this area now, I feel like I should turn off the middle screen so you don't all get epilepsy, but this is a great example of why. So my favorite area of this science at the moment is a bunch of scientists from completely different specialisms, so a biochemist, an electronic engineer, and a neurologist, who are developing these sensors that you can implant into your brain that use these organic materials. They can detect really small levels of neural activity, so tiny, tiny electronic signals, and then simultaneously pump out a neurotransmitter and target where that neurotransmitter goes. And this is incredible, right? For anyone suffering from epilepsy, it means that I really don't know how to turn off that middle screen, but if someone in the back can do it magically, make it happen, because it's stressing me out. So this is incredible for everyone who has epilepsy that you can't treat with medicine, which is about 30%, but also people who don't want invasive surgery. And this only works because these materials are organic, so they're completely biocompatible. You can put it in your head and it won't damage you, but they can also transport ions as well as electrons, which is really, really great for biology. A lot of people tell me, even though I'm a physicist. So I thought today I'd try and make this a kind of structured, thought-out presentation, why we need diversity in science a lot and why we need to keep talking about it, why I think we currently don't have it, and how different ways I think that we can achieve it, and hopefully you'll be on board with those and not going to hate me entirely. So firstly, on kind of the need for diversity, I think obviously the suffragette movement started here, which I didn't know until about 10 minutes ago, but this is massive, right? One part is just that it's fair. We had the equal rights movement in America. We've had votes now for some women in the UK for just over 100 years, and we still don't have equality or huge amounts of diversity in the majority of university departments, irrespective of whether they're science or not. One other part is, I think, massively it influences the systems and the science that we create. I don't know how many of you in this room remember when the UK Parliament announced their Science and Technology Select Committee in the summer of 2017, but it was a group of lovely looking men and no woman, very notably, and this was criticized so quickly on Twitter. People really jumped on this and ran with it, to the extent that they then took a woman to kind of fill this position, which is even worse, right? Tokenism at the last minute, saying we have to have someone. But I think this is really important because they decide where we go as a country. They decide the science that this country massively invests in. These big science projects is now being entirely decided, or was going to be, by a group of men. And I guess the worst part is they still thought this was okay. You know, someone in this PR department put together this image that they shared all over the world and thought, this looks fine, let's just roll with it. But even bigger than that, a big freedom of information request into the EPSRC, which provide all the funding for engineering and physical science research, found that in 2016 and 2017, fewer than 7% of their massive grants went to teams led by women. And I think this has, again, a massive impact on what we choose to do as scientists. Broader than that, though, I think the systems and the science that we create has a really, really detrimental effect if it's created by a team of similar-looking white men. I don't know if you've seen all these studies on bias in facial recognition software. Kind of caveat, interesting thing, I was speaking to someone who's campaigning massively against this at the moment. So facial recognition software is trained almost entirely on young white men in California. I really need to turn off this screen. Something, I don't know how to make it happen. It's going to be awful. I'm going to break it. I made it better. So, no one's up in that little house anymore. Do you think you know how to do it?
I have no idea how to do it. We're just going to keep pressing the button in the off chance.
It's all right. I'm sorry.
Don't worry about it. Don't worry.
Let's just roll with it anyway. Okay, I'll just keep looking at you and nod at that. So, facial recognition software is entirely trained on white young men in California, and that has a huge impact on the kind of faces that they can recognize. And this was a big exposure by people at the MIT Media Lab. And someone else I was talking to said, we really shouldn't be putting in all of these diverse faces. You know, facial recognition software is fundamentally quite an evil, cynical, observing kind of thing, and we don't want to do that in technology. But it's still pretty awful, right? And Amazon built this tool to try and recruit more people and to try and target their job adverts, and then found out they were only targeting them at men because they were the people who'd been working for Amazon. And even bigger in the field of kind of medicine and health research, the lack of women in medical trials has really big impacts on the kind of drugs that we create or the kind of way that people are observed if they're suffering from a particular condition. I don't know how many of you have seen the kind of Twitter and social media and news coverage of Caroline Criado Perez's new book that's coming out soon, really looking at the biases in data in the whole world and how that's impacted the entirety of society. But she exposes all of these really frightening things. And if you're interested, I think the book is just out or coming out later on. But that you're 50% more likely to be misdiagnosed of heart attack if you're a woman, 70% more likely of Google Home software not recognizing your voice if you're a woman, 11% of studies for cures for HIV are women. These things are really, really frightening. And I think that the lack of diversity in the teams that create all of this has a huge impact on what they do going forward. I also think that different voices bring a whole new, massively important part to our discovery and discussion about science. I don't know how many of you recognize Lisa Meitner. I'm hoping some of you do. So she was a nuclear physicist at the beginning of the 1900s. She was a Jewish woman in Vienna when it wasn't a great time to be Jewish or a woman going into a physics department. She was the first person to get her PhD in this university where she went in Germany, and then she was one of the pioneers and the discoverers of nuclear fission. She had a different perspective on this whole area of science because of everything she brought with her, right? She was always in a minority. When her research group and supervisors were publishing papers, they left her name off because she was Jewish and because she was a woman. And she said, this isn't right. You know, when all of the stuff about the atomic bomb was happening and all of this, she said, this is fundamentally a terrible area and we shouldn't do this as scientists. And her voice was different and brought something different to that. I'm hoping everyone in the room knows Jocelyn Bell Burnell, but she is a British astrophysicist, and she was at Cambridge in 50 years ago exactly, and she discovered pulsars, and she discovered this by meticulously searching the night sky for these radio waves and these repeated signals. And she made this discovery, she put this together because she looked at the data and thought differently to the rest of her colleagues who were all men and all super posh, and she'd come from this different background. And I really think they're great big testaments to why we need diversity, but even more so, I watched this incredible film. I don't know if you've watched this documentary about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her impact on women's rights movements in America, but she was a real pioneer in saying we've got to change this, and such an inspirational person. Or Joy Buolamwini, who's the one who's campaigned to get all of this bias in facial recognition software removed. Or great Greta Thunberg. You've got people now who are thinking differently to everyone else and having a massive impact on what they're doing in science. I think why we need to keep talking about this, though, goes much bigger. So I don't know if you saw this awful article in the Telegraph a couple of years ago, but saying that boys are better at physics because they learn about projection when going to the toilet. So it's kind of like all of these stereotypes that we've had just keep pervading every single aspect of our lives, or these endless discussions about men and women thinking differently and our brains being different, and it's tedious and relentless. But then coming back to this bias and facial recognition thing, I saw this tweet the other day, which was quoting an article by a big report from the US government, where they were saying that facial recognition software intrinsically can't recognize black faces because they all look the same. This was a report that the government put out in February 2019. Or this was from an American astrophysicist who was looking quite a lot at the representation in different astrophysics PhDs in America. And she's really great, this Professor Weschler, and she was tweeting that it's pretty awful that underrepresented minorities make up only 3% of astronomy students. And then someone replied with, what if they're just not culturally interested in the profession? So I think we do need to keep having these conversations. You know, these are both within the past 2 weeks, and I really think if we don't keep having them, nothing will change. So the next part on why science isn't diverse, obviously, if any of you care about this a lot and care particularly about access to education, it starts really, really young. So this is the representation of students studying different A-levels, boys on the left and girls on the right. And as you can see, in subjects that are super important to me, like physics is way down at number 16 for girls, consistently number 2 for boys. Further, maths, which is really, really important, is way down at number 25 for girls. And then in 2016, when this data is taken from, girls only made up 450 computing students. There are only 450, probably fewer than can fit in this lecture theatre, girls studying computing in the entire country. And the really, really depressing thing, particularly about physics, is this hasn't changed for decades and decades and decades. For maths, we've started to increase it gradually. This is the red line on here. This shows the percentage of girls in A-level classes. Red is maths, blue is physics. Before you get excited, it goes from 15 to 45%. And we've gradually increased the number of girls in A-level maths, but we've done really, really little for the number of girls in A-level physics. And as someone who speaks about this quite a lot, and some of you in the audience might be in the same position, you get bombarded all the time with trolls on the internet who say there's some difference in our biology and this is why. But there's absolutely no evidence for this. There was a huge Nature study done a couple of years ago where they took 1.5 million STEM grades from students. So they had all of these American students who had studied science subjects. They compared their grades in science subjects to their grades more broadly in all the subjects that they look at. And an argument that these lovely trolls that take to abusing me on Twitter say all the time is there's this bigger variance in men's IQ. So men are better represented at the top and the bottom of the spectrum, so we have way more genius men, right? Because this variance in their IQ is more spread out. And what this study found was, while that's true consistently for the majority of subjects, so for everything, boys perform a bit better and a bit worse. For science subjects, that's not true at all. It's much more narrow distribution, and actually girls consistently outperform boys. And this is really similar to everything that we collect in the UK on A-level data. I guess the other interesting thing, it hasn't always been this way. I read these 2 fantastic books that if you're interested in the teaching of science in the UK at all in the early 1900s, you should check out. One is called, they're written by a couple of science historians, and one is called Chemistry Was Their Life, and the other was called A Chemical Passion. And in this, it goes through how in the early 1900s, girls were doing incredible things in sciences, particularly in chemistry and the physical sciences. They were going really far to be able to study sciences at all. At their schools, they wouldn't have science labs, so they'd go in horses and carts to be able to get into industrial facilities to do science. And this was kind of early 1900s to about 1915. And then there was a big report in 1923 called the Haddo Report, which looked at girls' access to education. And it was basically because at the time a bunch of boys were getting very jealous. They were learning Latin and Greek, and they were getting very jealous of how girls were exceeding their expectations in physics and chemistry and biology. And when this report came out, it had a really big impact on the subjects that we study. So after this report said things like, the most fitting and the most important thing for girls to do when they go to school is to learn duties of motherhood and how we should work in the home. It then discussed the amount of hemoglobin that we had in our blood and said that we weren't well suited to subjects like physics and chemistry and demanding scientific subjects. And also we're not so physically strong, and we might get spinal curvature or defective eyesight. And after this was a government policy report, and after this they completely changed it, and they took physical sciences off the girls' curriculum and went back to doing domestic science. And this really stuck for an incredibly long time until the Second World War happened and women had to go back into science labs to be able to study again. But I guess education policy has a massive impact, and so too does everything that we give children and the way that we treat and think about young women. I know that you're all familiar with these ridiculous stereotypes now, especially if you follow Twitter accounts like Let Toys Be Toys. But I think they have a huge, huge impact on the way that girls perceive themselves and the way that they have confidence in going forward to do different things. From Kinder, who have these horrific kind of fashion dolls for girls and then these great little cars that boys get, or this Gap ad campaign where girls got the t-shirts that said social butterfly and boys got little scholar and spelled Einstein wrong on their t-shirts, or this Lego. So Lego, which is usually great, right? And if you meet a young woman scientist or engineer, so many of them will credit playing with Lego to their success in whatever subject they're studying now. And Lego realized they weren't selling much in Europe, so did all these focus groups with parents and came out with this kit for boys, which is called Lego City and looks really, really great and fun, and I'd like to play with it. Or girls who get these kind of ridiculous pink outfits and bakeries and cameras, and the little characters in Lego Friends World are 1.5 times the size of a normal Lego, so they just look absolutely preposterous. And even if you go away from the toys and that, and you go and think about books, a big study that happened last year found that only 19% of Time 100's top most published kids books and most popular kids books, only 19% of them are led by a woman, so only 19% of these have a female protagonist in. The main character in these will be a woman. Fewer than 1% of the books published in 2017 had a black or minority ethnic main character. And that's just for kids' books, right? So this is massively important. But when you even look at medical textbooks, so something where you think there's better representation of women, right? You've got 50-50 in undergraduate degrees. 78% of the faces in medical textbooks that were studied by the Lancet in early 2019, 78% of the faces you encounter were men. And this has a really, really big impact. Again, if you're interested in this kind of area, and particularly the way that it might challenge the way that people perceive themselves, another great book that's just come out is called The Gendered Brain, and this is by Gina Rippon, who's a neuroscientist. And in this, she talks massively about this concept of neuroplasticity. So we're constantly learning. Our brains are constantly training from when we're born to, right into we're in our old elderly ages. And you pick up the things that the world puts upon you, right? If you're endlessly given a bunch of pink toys, if you're endlessly told not to have all of this different kind of spatial recognition tasks, if you're not told to play around with things, if you're given books where you're never represented and you never see anyone who looks like you, that really, really impacts the way that you feel and have confidence in yourself going forward. And I think she's done a kind of phenomenal job. I've only read a few interviews in The Guardian with this, but it looks like an incredible book. And I guess what science has done is really, really try massively to plug this idea of a leaky pipeline. We've endlessly filled it with more kind of Barbies doing a science toys, thinking that we can fix this massive stereotyping by stereotyping even more, right? So we know we've got this challenge in books, in the language, in the toys, and yet the campaigns relentlessly try and make science more pink. I don't know if you saw this video, and if you didn't, it's your homework for tonight. But Science, It's a Girls Thing was released by the European Commission in 2012. And I really think they weren't setting out to be awful and do something damaging, but this shows how much bad impact you can have if you don't really think through what you're trying to put out and go forward. So there's a lot of these videos. It didn't stop in 2012. They got so criticized for this, they had to keep taking it off. They endlessly try and take it off YouTube. But even now, people are investing hundreds of thousands of pounds into these video campaigns to try and make science more girly, thinking that this is going to fix all of the other problems. We do this big thing of sending in high-achieving role models, so we get scientists to go in and do a talk in a lunchtime for 1 hour about how incredible they are and all the awards they've won, and feel like that's going to resonate with an entire class of 25 kids, and there's very little evidence that this alone as a one-off intervention will have any impact. We run all of these girls-only science competitions and classes, which isn't really similar to real life. And then something that's kind of upsetting me more and more recently, and the more I talk about this, people tell me to go and look at all of these fantastic books, like, 1,000 Fantastic Women, all of these fantastic women from history, and it's like we've got to a stage now where we're really frightened about stereotyping and we want to stop doing it, so we're stereotyping even more, right? We're now writing books that are particularly targeted at girls and boys. And I don't think this is the right thing to do. But if you're interested in education and really things that are going forward, I think the Institute of Physics have done some fantastic work, not just looking at physics education, but also improving gender balance across the whole science curriculum. And they've set up now, with the support of the Mayor of London, a campaign which is called Gender Action, which is really trying to get schools to evaluate their stereotypes and improve, kind of share best practice, obviously very similar to Athena Swan, but try and improve access to education for everyone, recognizing that you can't have more girls in a physics classroom without having more boys in drama and psychology, and actually their underrepresentation there is as important as girls' underrepresentation in physics and further maths. So I guess going forward and thinking about what I wanted to talk today is really looking at the retention of women in sciences. And this is no surprise to anyone, right? These pictures of kind of a quote-unquote leaky pipeline. But I don't think it is a leaky pipeline. So this is physics, if you want to know just how awful physics is. It starts with about a fifth of girls studying A-level physics. We get about the same at undergraduate level, a few more if you go to a university like Manchester, because you get so many coming in from overseas. And then it just gradually decreases to about 6% of the professors being women. For medicine, it starts completely differently, but it's a pretty similar story later on. But I really don't think this is anything that women are doing wrong. I really think this is science failing women. I think it is so important that women are there at the party having these conversations, but I think something within the scientific community is really, really pushing them out. And when you look around, when you start to read the newspapers, I think it's pretty obvious why. So I think that women primarily leave science due to bullying, sexual harassment, which is rife across UK universities, the uncertain pathways and routes within academic careers. And of course, you can discuss and say this impacts men and women, and obviously it does, but actually when you're in a minority, when you're somewhere every day where you don't see people who look like you and you have none of those networks to talk to about how awful of this is, it can have a massive, massive impact on your self-confidence and belief to do that subject. And I think if we work to end this bad practice, we'd just have diversity naturally. You know, you wouldn't have to have these kind of lectures, you wouldn't have to apply for Athena Swan if we didn't have this behavior happening. And then there are the constant kind of psychological battles that you face if you're in a minority, so things like imposter syndrome and unconscious bias. And then really important to nail the shared parental leave and get proper access to maternity leave. I was in Prague yesterday with the British Embassy, and they had this whole day on women in science, and this professor was speaking with me, and he was talking about how he'd created this award scheme for women coming back from maternity leave, and he'd recognized that his students and his postdocs needed it, so it made this fellowship for women. And then at the end of his talk, which the whole time I was like, great, you are a hero, that's so great. And then at the end he said, yeah, but I was talking to my wife who's a psychologist, and she says, we're doing all this for the women, but think about the damage that we're doing to the children. And then his wife got up from the audience and said how damaging it was for women not to be there at home for those kind of first 10 years of their life. And this was to the British Embassy in Prague. And Prague has a really backwards view on this. So they have, I'm really sorry if anyone's from Prague, I did love it deeply as a city. But if you're a woman in Prague and you take maternity leave, it's 3 years. After 3 years, you can put your child in nursery, but you have to stay off for 3 years. They have nothing that you can access before. And I was kind of sitting there, I'm the product of academic maternity leave. My mum put me in the UCL day nursery at 6 weeks old, right? So that was really big and important for me. And you just think, actually, we really need to make sure that this is completely provided and comprehensively supported by universities. But beyond that, there's much more, there's much deeper things within academic science. So there's very, very conscious bias. There's a huge lack of women and non-Westerners in peer review. This was a big study by Nature last year, looking at who lots of different academic publishers allocated review to. So looking at where when you submit a paper, you're all academics, so I don't need to explain this to you. If you submit a paper, you choose who you might want to do peer review, and then they allocate it to someone. And time again, that's not going to women and non-Westerners. Men are much more likely to get their papers accepted. They're also much more likely to get their papers cited. They're also, frighteningly, this is the last one on this slide, and I can send them all to you later on, much more likely to cite themselves. So there's a lot of bias in this whole process, which has a really big impact on whether you're going to get a big fellowship or that huge starting grant. And then there's bias in the allocation of grants. So there was a big study done by the Canadian Institute for Health Research looking at the way they allocate grants, and they had these two different stages. So in stage one, they're evaluating based on the scientist. So they're looking at your resume and your CV and who you are. And in stage two, they're evaluating based on the science and the proposals that you make. And they found consistently, if you evaluate people based on your CV and your resume, women are being scored worse and women are allocated less money. But if you remind people to just allocate you based on your science, so based on the thing that you're proposing to do, they fare equally as well. And this has been a big thing by the Irish Research Council, who in 2013 had absolutely no policies to try and get people to remember to focus on the science. So in 2013, they're evaluating very much on your resume, your reference letter, and all the other things that you put into an application. they decided to gender blind their applications. So they took away this idea of evaluating based on who you are and just focused on the science. And that was in 2014, and they went up to 44%, but now on 57% success rate for women applying for these grants. So this is absolutely incredible, right? When women are evaluated based on their science, not based on who they are doing so much better than before, and that's something I think that we need to keep having these conversations and discussing. And I guess the way that academia, oh, nice little putting in a sign of Ireland there, well done, Jess. I think the way that academia has thought about solving these things, and we can discuss this later because I guess everyone has an interesting perspective, is to kind of try and diversity train their way out of it. It's this idea that you'll give unconscious bias training to everyone, none of which has been shown to have massive impact anywhere, and has actually, you know, it can have a hugely detrimental impact. You can wake up biases in the people that you're training, and it can provide this false illusion that actually everything's okay when really it's not. So all of this diversity stuff goes very much on changing individuals and their practices rather than structural change within universities. There's a strange belief, especially amongst really senior male scientists, that anything with diversity is going to somehow detriment a meritocracy, and we're going to just be pushing women in who actually don't have the rights to be there. And I think this is really awful and something that I think we really need to talk about a lot more and try and change. And then this idea that you can fix all of this by changing the women, right? We're going to make women behave a lot more like men. We're going to make them more assertive, more confident, all of this big trend to lean in. I think that has a really big impact on the way that we think about diversity and whether we can sustainably change it. So I guess how I think we can achieve it and different things that people are doing, and I know you're doing so much of this at Manchester already, and there are so many networks here that are really championing this. But one is to really find a mentor or be a mentor. This has been shown to have a huge impact on women in science and their completion both of a PhD or a postdoc afterwards, and how successful they are. And I think you have to be at a time in your life when you're ready to be mentored, right? But finding someone who'll give you advice, who'll give you structural advice about your career, but also think about things that might not be in academia and how they can support you. Someone that you can talk to who's not directly involved with what you're doing next. I think that's really important. I think on the whole, we need to get better at talking about mental health. I know this is a massive challenge with students, early career researchers, senior researchers. There was a great feature in Nature a couple of months ago, and go and read all of these if you haven't read them already, but they were talking about challenges to mental health throughout your academic career, from very senior professors talking about how it impacted them when they were a PhD student, to really junior people talking about how it impacts them every day now. And I know, because my mum, who trained here, remember, is an academic psychiatrist, that access to mental health support within universities is nowhere near as good as it should be, but really finding people around you who you can talk to and trust and rely on, and then finding support in other ways, whatever that thing is, whether it's well-being, mindfulness, you name it. But finding access to that is so important, and I really think this does impact minorities and underrepresented groups more. I think you shouldn't be afraid. We all need to speak truth to power more often. I don't know if you remember this horrific incident that happened by a great, lovely professor of physics last summer, who gave a presentation to a bunch of early career women scientists, like kind of like me getting up on this stage now, and gave this presentation and said that all the women who succeeded in science did so because of tokenism, because of affirmative action, that actually men had invented physics and would continue to invent and champion physics. And he was a very angry man. He was very angry because a woman had just been made director of the research institute where he had applied. But speaking up and calling this out was really important. You know, the whole audience of that room at the time was early career women in high energy particle physics who really wanted the opportunity to be able to continue their careers in high energy particle physics. And they were nervous, and everyone was speaking, and there was a big email discussion about whether anyone should say something. But it did have an impact. So there was a response by 5,500 very senior high energy particle physicists. This guy got suspended pending an investigation. You know, you feel like you're really small, you feel like you're doing something on social media, you feel like you're sending an email to a few people, but you can change things in a really big way. And we've seen this now also with these cases of academic bullying coming out. People who feel like they've not been treated very well coming together and going forward and speaking to people and saying that this isn't right, we need to stop doing this and we need to make science better for everyone. Another case where I've seen this really brilliant recently is looking back to this thing I mentioned before about the lack of the huge stereotyping and bias that impacts academic funding. And actually at the beginning of this year, a bunch of academics from right across the UK came together. This was all in a Twitter chat. It has 50 people and it's very stressful to try and manage. that came together and said, we want to change this and we want to challenge this. And there's a great professor of material science at the University of Cambridge who put together a piece of evidence for UK Parliament. So now they're doing a huge inquiry into the transparency and equality of opportunities going into grant funding. And this was literally a bunch of frustrated people who were completely unconnected. No one was in the same place at the same time, as far as I can tell, coming together and pushing the government to do something. So if something is annoying you, you can have a big impact very quickly. You've also seen it in Time's Up and the Me Too movement. I don't know if any of you follow this phenomenal doctor called Esther Chu on Twitter. I started following her because she does all these hilarious threads about, this thread was brilliant. Is it gender bias or do I just suck? And then she went through with all of these kids diagrams in kids books and went through and kind of made a funny joke about them. Anyway, that doesn't do testament to how great she is. She's also an emergency doctor. She's Korean American. She consistently faces racism and sexism in the emergency room that she works in, but she's come together with a bunch of other phenomenal women doctors, medics in America, and had this Time's Up movement for healthcare, really trying to provide sustained support for women who experience sexual harassment and bullying within a medical environment. And I was reading about the launch of this. It was actually covered in InStyle, if you want to read more about it later. And in the US, the biggest claimants of Time's Up support, so legal support for sexual harassment, has obviously been in Hollywood. The biggest claimant after that is women in medicine and women in healthcare. So this movement is super powerful. And this was a bunch of American doctors in completely different states, only connected through social media, making something big happen. And we've had it in the UK too. I don't know if any of you followed the action of the 1752 group, but this was all run by a British astrophysicist who actually works at Imperial. She set up this group, which is a lobbying organisation to try and investigate the prevalence of staff-student sexual harassment in the UK and then create policy to protect people against it. And she's been, she's done this all alongside her research in astrophysics and having 3 kids. But she's been absolutely incredible at driving structural change within universities now. So in physics, we don't just have Athena Swan, we also have something called the Juno Award, recognizing that physics faces particular challenges. And she's implemented a step on that Juno Award, a criteria now, which is to look at your departmental culture and really look at the support you give for people who suffer from sexual harassment. And this is one person. And really, I genuinely think that we can keep championing this and changing it. So what other things do I think we can do? I think we need to get better at nominating scientists from underrepresented groups for awards and honours. You had Lisa Meitner, I put this number there, which is quite frightening, discovering nuclear fission. Her supervisor's going on to win the Nobel Prize. She was nominated 48 times and didn't win. And we really need to get better at doing this. And I know we've got Donna Strickland now, so great. The Women in Physics movement has someone. But you had Jocelyn Bell-Burnell, also, who I mentioned before, discovered pulsars. Again, her supervisors went on to win the Nobel Prize for Physics. She, though, last summer, and I hope you followed this if you care about equality and diversity, but she won the Breakthrough Prize for Science, which is $3 million, and she's invested all of that money into the postgraduate research of scientists from underrepresented groups. So she said, actually, we do need this. We need people thinking differently to be involved in this conversation in science, or we won't make the breakthroughs that we need to. And I think keeping thinking about that, whether it's an award from the Institute of Physics or whether it's an award from the Royal Society or anything like that, keep nominating people for these prizes, whether it's a fellowship or not. So many learned societies really want to be doing more now, but they can't do it unless people like you and this audience think about who you nominate. I went through the Institute of Physics list the other day. There's still so many awards that have never been won by a woman or never been won by someone that aren't white, and the only people who can change that are us. I think it's also super important to join networks. You have the leader of Science Girl here in the audience today. Hello, Heather. But beyond that, there are networks for whatever thing that you're underrepresented and a minority in, right? 500 Women Scientists is great if you don't know it. I think they also have a group in Manchester. But this started as a response to Trump coming into power, and it was a bunch of annoyed academic women scientists, and they've come together and they got their name 500 Women Scientists because they thought, we'll get to 500 by the end of the week, that's fine, let's just call it that. They now have 22,000 women scientists on their database, and they're called for comment all the time. They speak to Scientific American, to Nature. They've just set up a fellowship for minority women scientists to be able to continue being advocates and keep that aligned with their research. This idea that you can't keep going around and doing doing all of this diversity work without being recognized and championed for it. But they have had so much impact. Join that. Pride in STEM, which is a UK-based charity for LGBTQ+ scientists, 500 queer scientists, again, similar to 500 women scientists, Association for Black and Minority Ethnic Engineers. All of these things are super important, not only for you building networks and gaining confidence, but also giving you career opportunities and everything for afterwards. I can't understate how important joining these things are. I also think that people in positions of power, if they're not, the underrepresented minority, if you are a white man, you have a massive impact on the success of women and minority scientists. There was another great article in Nature the other day. I'm giving Nature a lot of love, so hopefully one day they'll give me some love. No, I'm joking. So there was a great article in Nature about successful men and how they've really championed and supported women in their labs, but obviously you can all do it. So you can all spend more time looking for women scientists. If you're putting together a conference program, be warned, Twitter will jump on you very quickly if you've got an entire lineup of men, but also think strategically about who you want to invite to speak, whether it's a big international conference or seminars that you're doing or offering opportunities for undergraduate research projects or postdocs, whatever. I think we need to get better at writing about women scientists and also citing them, something that I come up against a lot, and I'll talk about Wikipedia in a minute. But the lack of coverage of women scientists and their discoveries and everything really impacts the way that we can document them for history, right? If a woman scientist publishes this huge paper, it's very much less likely than a male scientist to be picked up by the BBC or the Guardian or all of these big news sites, and we need to get better at writing about them, but obviously also better at citing them. I think prepare to be a mentor or an advocate or a sponsor. This is a big thing in America, that you won't only mentor people and give advice, but you'll have someone strategically, your sponsor, who will look out for you and put you forward for things. The shortlist for TED Fellows comes up. You email the kind of great, enthusiastic, young, early career researcher in your lab and say, this is a really cool thing for you to apply for. Having those people in your science life, in your science career, is really important. And then also to listen and champion and support and amplify. This idea of amplifying women's voices really started in the Obama government, and he had a few women, more women than had been for a long time in that party, but he had a few of them and they didn't feel like they were being heard, so they just used to amplify what each other was saying, right? You'd have a meeting and a few of them would amplify the next thing that the other person was saying. Oh man. Promise, that wasn't me. And I think all of those are really great. So we can all have this huge impact if we take on these things. And obviously in the UK, we have Athena Swan, we have the Institute of Physics, we have the Race Equality Charter, we have Stonewall, and that's all really nice. But when you look at the data, it's really frightening, and nothing seems to be changing at the pace that it should do. So there's a big data science study done exactly 1 year ago, I think. And in this study, for the kind of keen-eyed among you, you can notice that in academic publishing in the life sciences, so in biology, you're on a good track. It's only going to take 16 years to reach 50-50, but in physics it's going to take 258, and that's pretty terrible for all of the young physicists in the world. Or things like, we had a great lecture at Imperial the other day by Dr. Ben Britton, who's a Royal Academy of Engineering Research Fellow, and he is an openly gay engineer, and he says even now, 2019, he has to think before he travels whether he can be openly gay and whether his social media might impact him if he's applying to go to a conference or if he's thinking about where to host a conference. And then we have this massive inequality of black and minority ethnic scientists in the UK, just academics in general. This was a big study done by the Equality Challenge Unit, and there are only 26, I think, black women professors in the UK, but the lack of representation there is absolutely appalling and should be something that we're nationally embarrassed about. And I think we are. So all of this bummed me out so much to think that actually we have to try on our own to be activists. We have to be micro-activists in our labs and in our bedrooms and on our holidays. I read this incredible book that was so kindly introduced in the introduction, and also Angela came to speak here last year, but Inferior was massive for me, not only because it challenges all of these different stereotypes and talks about how bad the science is behind them, but also because it introduces to you to all of these phenomenal women through history who've been saying this isn't right. It was Charles Darwin who said women were intellectually inferior, and when he was writing this, there were women from all over the world writing to him, morally superior, for everyone who's looking horrified in the audience, we're morally superior but intellectually inferior. And so there were women all over the world writing to him and saying, this isn't right, I can't vote, I can't own property, I can't even go to university, how can you compare me to a man? And I guess we can do that too. We need to keep having these voices and keep changing it. So obviously, book meant a lot, took it all over the world, gave it to every single impressive scientist I met, took it to a bunch of different countries and all of these conferences we had. It formed this incredible community on Twitter, so this huge network of women and men scientists who are really challenging all of these stereotypes, so much so that it launched a book club. It launched a feminist book club in Australia that now has groups all over the world of women scientists coming together to read books, and also men are obviously welcome. About the same time I read this amazing book, I met this incredible woman called Dr. Alice White, who is a historian of science at the Wellcome Trust, and her job at the Wellcome is to get all of their archived content onto Wikipedia. So it's great that we publish all these science things and do all these science things internally at universities, but it's very hard to have that huge reach that you want, because really only a bunch of scientists read the other kind of things that we do. And Alice's job at the Wellcome is saying, we've got all this great content, we want the entire world to see it, so she uploads their content to Wikipedia and makes the quality about things the Wellcome are interested in on Wikipedia better. As mentioned also kindly in the introduction, maybe that was a very compressed version of my talk, so very good. But Wikipedia is super biased. It's actually very similar to academic departments. Only 17.5% of the biographies on English-speaking Wikipedia are about women. This is not just for science. I know before you think that's quite a high number. This is for all women doing anything impressive ever throughout history. And this is for English language Wikipedia. Actually, it's true for all languages other than Welsh, because it's very small and they got to 50-50 in a day. So we can't do that in English-speaking Wikipedia. But it's because, and this was also introduced, but 90% of Wikipedia editors are white men, largely men in America, and so they really cover things about whatever they're interested in. And these are obscure football teams, cricket players who've never scored, old politicians, but really no representation of women or minority scientists at all. And I guess the depressing thing, coming off the back of seeing Caroline Criado-Perez's book coming out, is that this is pretty similar to the percentage of women on banknotes, right? So there's very few women on banknotes in the UK, very similar to the number of women on statues, and even better than the number of women who are on blue plaques and in this kind of celebrated and notable in a society. And this annoyed me so much that I tried to change it. And since the beginning of 2018, I've been making these Wikipedia pages every single day about a scientist or an underrepresented minority, scientist or engineer or anyone who's doing great stuff. And this has been absolutely incredible. I saw a really great professor from Imperial speaking the other day, and he's been a really big activist in trying to increase the representation of black and minority ethnic scientists studying there. And he said that doing all of this advocacy has let him go out and meet all of these people. You know, he had this great wall of photos of him with all these impressive scientists. And I feel so lucky to be able to learn all of this incredible stuff about all of these scientists and how they've accessed science and the research that they do. And it's made me think so differently about scientific careers. You know, people have the most interesting and fascinating stories. And actually, you know, you may not want to travel, you may just want to sit at home and do this, but you can be so inspired every single day by learning about the science that these people do. Great people that I've come across, people like Dawn Shaw-Ganesi, who's a radiochemist in America who discovered 5 of the super heavy elements in the periodic table, all of which had really comprehensive Wikipedia pages, none of which mentioned her, and she didn't have one. Or Susan Goldberg, who's super fascinating. I saw her talk a couple of years ago, and she is the first woman and first Jewish person ever to edit the National Geographic. And she has had a huge career in journalism and media in America, and has been really instrumental. If any of you subscribe to the National Geographic, I know it's a bit posh, but it's beautiful. And she's been really big in changing the way they tell stories. They've given ownership a lot more to the people who read it, completely changed their social media and everything like that. She also launched this edition of the National Geographic on gender, and it started off as looking at girls' access to education, and she got so criticized for doing it. And people said, make it about gender, make it more broadly. Before they even released it, 10,000 people cancelled their subscription because they were so angry that they were doing it. And then people sent her the edition back, sent them back to the National Geographic. Anyway, this was January 2017, I think, when they launched it. It was so successful it won a Pulitzer Prize for journalism, and so many other science places now have taken on this issue in a really massive and public way. My favorite Wikipedia page, though, ever, is Dr. Gladys West, whose page I made in February last year, and I watched a video about her on CNN during Black History Month in America. And she is an African-American mathematician who was born in the 1930s, and so she's kind of early, just getting towards her 90s now. And she was really instrumental in the early days for discovering GPS technologies. You know, they did all the early programming, very like Hidden Figures, I felt, when I was writing it. And she was a mathematician on this team of scientists and engineers at a time when there really weren't many women doing this and really weren't many people of color doing it. And when I made this page, it was hard to find information about her. I had to go through her church and all the stuff that she'd done in like community stuff, going through all these funny kind of newspaper archives. It makes you feel like a real detective. It's really great fun. And since then, she's been nominated twice for BBC 100 Women. So you go from having 300 or 400 page views a day to, 5,500 page views a day. This year, she's been in every Black History Month Twitter list and all of these big celebrations. And she's just been inducted into the US Air Force Hall of Fame. Look how great this, so now my mission is to try and meet her, which she's just absolutely incredible. So we've done amazing things with this Wikipedia stuff. We've gone all over the world to have Wiki editathons. I don't know why that picture came up so weirdly. Oh God, what's happening to my voice? So we went all over and we've done these Wikipedia editathons with school groups, with universities, with so many people in different learned societies, you name it. And it's been absolutely incredible, the kind of discussion we've generated, not only about bias on Wikipedia, but bias in so many forms of academic and scientific life. This week alone, we've had Wiki editathons in Boston, in Cambridge, all over, literally all over the world. People are talking about and doing this now. And I think it's really, really incredible. So much so that it's had huge amounts of kind of press and media coverage, which has been kind of overwhelming and intimidating and cool. But it meant that we could set up this crowdfunder to get a copy of Inferior into every single secondary state school in the UK. So it started off relatively small. It was me and Claire Murray, who's here, who's a great chemist at the Diamond Light Source. And it started off as just thinking, okay, we have a few followers on Twitter, we'll get the 200 all-girls state schools, that's achievable. And we did that in one day, so we set it up to go nationally, and that only took 12 days. We set up a similar one in New York that I'm doing with my friend Mariam, who is one of the leadership team of 500 women scientists. With my friend Laurie, we're running one also in New Zealand, and they're also running one in Canada. And the really exciting and really cool thing is they've now made this copy of the books to get into all schools. It's a schools edition, so cool. So this started... I guess this is a story in itself. I was just thinking, Angela, we need to do something with all of this really good enthusiasm, right? I was having all of these emails from people all over the world saying, this is so great, we've been bummed out by the lack of evidence, let's all edit Wikipedia, let's celebrate all of these people. And then I was cycling home from university and I sent her an email saying, I think we're going to do this. I made this draft of a crowdfunding thing. And by the time I got home, she'd already tweeted it. So I was like, oh, now we really have to do this. I see this big commitment happening. And I hadn't asked the book people whether this was okay. And I didn't even know. I imagined myself sitting at my kitchen table, kind of wrapping up 400 books to send out. And then it became something much bigger so quickly. And, you can do all that from your desk and from your lab. So I want to end with saying, I think people are doing things incredibly differently now. And I really think that young women are driving the change, whether it's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Greta Thunberg or all of this young women's movement globally, driving the change and asking different questions. We also have had phenomenal success for women scientists, more so than ever before. We had Donna Strickland and Frances Arnold, we had Jocelyn Bell-Burnell, and actually this year, and I think this is probably the first time it's ever happened, there's a woman leading every major scientific society that's mentioned in this. I know we have way more than that in the UK, but I think that's really big. And what's really big for me especially is my dad, who's largely been absent from these conversations, who is a neurologist, sent me a text and said, I really think Mary Riley deserves a Wikipedia page. So I was like, thanks, Dad, this is big now. And I do want to say that obviously the discussion needs to go away a bit more from gender diversity. We need equality and equal access for absolutely everyone. Angela's next book, and I'm sure every enthusiast in the audience will know, is looking at racism in science and really what science has done to try and challenge it and how little they've done to try and challenge it. There's a launch in London at the Royal Institution with all of the people who run the Minorities in STEM Twitter account, who are all really fantastic. And if you want to come, particularly if you're a student from an underrepresented background, they're giving away lots and lots of free tickets. And I think this will really be really big. I'm giving it to one of you to run the crowdfunding campaign for this because I have zero energy to do it now. But yeah, so I guess I wanted to end on the fact that even though you feel like you're very small, you can have a huge impact in the way that people perceive science, scientists, and also the way that young people access education. So thank you so much for having me. There's a bunch of other really great books that I think are incredible, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Jess. That was amazing. For those who don't know me, I'm Hema Radhakrishnan. I'm Associate Dean for Social Responsibility in the Faculty of Biology, Medicine and Health. And along with the 3 Athena Swan self-assessment teams, I had the responsibility for organizing the International Women's Day event. So in 2016 and 2018, we had Angela Sayani talking to us about Inferior, well, even before Inferior was published in 2016. And we thought, who do we have for following up that act? Because that was very popular and incredible. And Jess, you've definitely done it justice. Thank you very much. We would first have a few questions. We are sort of pushing for time, but we could probably take 2 or 3 questions if possible. Would that be okay?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Yeah. Any questions from the audience?
Hi, thank you very much. That was great. Could you tell me how you got into wiki editing?
Yeah, so Alice actually taught me. She is, her job is this Wikimedian in residence. So there's actually a bunch of Wikipedia editors all over the country who are loosely employed by Wikipedia. And they run training for you to learn how to edit Wikipedia. So I would say, even if you're not interested in improving the representation of women and minority scientists, learning to edit Wikipedia is really great for you as an educational tool, thinking about the way that you structure something and comments neutrally about something that you're interested in. And you can have this huge, huge coverage very quickly. So even if in your particular field you just want to improve the page on, say, organic electronics, you can be really sneaky and only link and cite your own research so that people think that that's a massive and important thing. But it has a huge impact on science, right? If the page about a particular area is more detailed and better studied, then it will impact the direction of science. There was a study done by this recently looking at the impact of the quality of Wikipedia pages on the kind of narrative and where interdisciplinary research went. So I learned it because Alice taught me, but actually, I mean, anyone who's done any editing in here will think like she's completely making this up. It's so easy to edit Wikipedia. If you can write an email or edit a Word document, you can edit Wikipedia. You just need to have someone to show you, I guess, first. So editing is great. Also, if you have any great images, if you're sitting next to a great professor right now, take a picture of them and put them on Wikipedia, on Wiki Commons, because there's a huge shortage there as well of images of underrepresented minorities and women scientists. So both things, super easy to do.
How do we do the other bit? How do we encourage men to embrace parenting? And because I think they're definitely discriminated against as well in that way.
Yeah, I actually think academia does a better job of this than lots of industry. I was speaking to Emma Chapman about, she's just taken maternity leave, and she says her husband is trying to take it. He works in tech industry, and for her, she'll get pretty good support from university and from the Royal Society Fellowship she's on. But if he takes it, he'll only get £200 a week. Like, he goes down to a ridiculous reduced pay from somewhere really big. So I do think that we need national policy on it, and you need to keep driving and pushing for these conversations to happen. You need really people in government who take this kind of thing very, very seriously. And hopefully now, you know, there's more academics and more scientists in government than ever before, and hopefully they'll start to have these kind of serious conversations. But I do think it's up to, you know, that Nature article was really, really good at looking at how men really need to take charge and push for this. You know, there's so many senior positions, whether it's organizing a conference or leading a research group or deciding who and who you don't shortlist. But I really think that the more people call out bad behavior and the more we push for this accountability from senior leadership, it will change. And you've seen it change in, you know, the last 2 years feels like a really big time in this movement, and we just have to keep the pressure on.
Great. Just one more question, and then...
Cool.
Thanks, that was really interesting, and it's inspired me to have a look at disabled women in science, and I wondered if you had anything to say or recommend about disabled women in science. Thanks.
Yeah, I think if you try and look through, there's some networks, and I will be completely stupid and not know a name of them, but for people who really champion successful disabled people in science, whether they're women or people of color, and I'll try and find one for you later on. And if it's particularly to edit Wikipedia or try and share their stories better, that's a really great way to do it. Again, coming back, the Institute of Physics, Royal Society of Biology, and Royal Society of Chemistry have done a lot of research into how the UK is doing on improving access to scientific undergraduate courses for people with disabilities, and in some ways, whilst it doesn't look like we're doing very well, it's actually doing a lot better than most of Europe, and they've released a really great publication that I can't remember the name of right now, but I can send to you later on, really comparing what universities do and what they need to do better for supporting people with disabilities. But it's something that I think, again, we need to get more vocal in talking about, and obviously very visible and invisible disabilities are important in this. But I suppose, yeah, networks, finding the people who are doing really cool and informative stuff already. I'll find some cool people whose Wikipedia pages I've made so that you can see them too.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that, Jess. It's brilliant to have some practical solutions for the problems that we're facing, and also to call out things that don't work. So for all of you, there should be a flyer on your desk which tells about more events that we're hosting. So we are hosting a Wiki editathon sort of thing, trying to tell you how to do Wikipedia pages. So please sign up for anything and everything that you're interested in. And also the feedback forms in front of you, which we would be grateful if you could complete. We would like to know your opinion and what you would like to see next year as well. And we asked you, what can we do for increasing gender balance or better the balance? So these are some options, but also we've got Women in Biology, Medicine and Health, the staff network group, and also the other network groups which are mentioned on this flyer. These are to make sure this is not just one female scientist coming and talking to you on one Wednesday afternoon. We've got lots and lots of Wednesday afternoons which you can come to and listen to much more inspiring work constantly, rather than it being once in a year. We do everything for International Women's Day or International Women's Week, and then it goes quiet. So to ensure that doesn't happen, please sign up to the staff network groups if you can. We've also been doing a campaign for ending period poverty, and we're collecting for the donation Emmeline's Pantry. If you've donated already, thank you very much for your support, and if you haven't managed to do it yet, Emmeline's Pantry is only down the road, so you can support this charity whenever you can, please. And finally, I would really like to thank the team who organized this. We wouldn't have been able to organize such a huge event without the support from the social responsibility team. Particularly, Kira Wright and Natalie Little have done a tremendous amount of work in doing this, and House for her leadership. House Williams has led the whole effort. Thank you for the entire social responsibility team for pulling this together. We've now got a networking event with some coffee and cake. So as Jess mentioned, it's important to form networks and develop mentoring schemes within the university. We've got the Manchester Gold at University of Manchester that you can sign up to, but also within the Faculty of Biology, Medicine and Health, we've got a new mentoring scheme which has started, which we're trying to get more and more academics and researchers to join, both as mentors and mentees. So if you're interested, please get in touch. You can get more information on the university website, but also through Women in BMH Network. If you want any information, please do contact us. Thanks very much, and look forward to joining you at the networking. Thank you.